Most people think that they know the story of the American West and the Civil War. But what if some of the most important stories have been forgotten? Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Megan Kate Nelson, a historian and author whose work explores the overlooked people who lived through some of the most dramatic moments in American history. Rather than focusing only on famous generals or political leaders, we'll explore some of the biggest myths about the Civil War and the American West, why certain stories get remembered while others disappear, and what these forgotten histories can teach us about America today. Dr. Nelson, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks for so much for having me, Jay. This is great.
Thank you. To start off, what first drew you to studying the Civil War and the American West?
Hmm. So I started out my career as a Southern historian. And when you study the American South, you sort of always get pulled into the Civil War. It feels like it's such a huge moment, not only for the nation, but especially for the South, and everyone who lived there. And so I wrote a book about Civil War destruction, of cities and houses and forests and bodies. And I kind of kept going with the Civil War because once you get like sucked into that topic, it's so huge and it has so many potential avenues of research that are super interesting that I continued to go with it. And I was teaching classes in Civil War history, and I discovered that there were these battles in the American far West, and I had not known about them. And I grew up in Colorado and had never learned about these Civil War battles that took place in New Mexico. And whenever that happens, when you're a historian, whenever you find out that there are these subjects like you just never learned and never had any idea about, that's what really kind of draws us to topics, right? So yeah, I started researching the Civil War battles in New Mexico and everyone who was involved in that conflict in that particular theater of the war. And the result was the book, The Three-Cornered War.
Yeah, and that's something that I find super interesting about American education and cases like the Civil War, because in all our school systems, schools have such a big mandate of topics that they have to cover, right? Even
Yep.
an American history course goes from 1600 to the year 2000, 400 years of history. And in
hmm
doing so, I feel like most students learn American history through a relatively simple narrative to get through all the material. What do you think that narrative leaves out of the actual histories that happen?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of the problem. I wish that we had in K through 12 education history every single year and we're really able to delve into topics really deeply, but that's just really impossible. I mean, history teachers have such a heavy load. They have to teach you so many things, including, topics and ideas and events and how to do research and how to write and that's a big ask, right? For teachers during a school year that's really only kind of nine and a half months long. And when they only see you kind of 45 minutes a day, maybe four times a week. So a lot gets left out and it just kind of has to. You just don't have enough time. And a lot of textbooks also leave a lot out. And this is what a lot of teachers, often base their classes on. And I've done that certainly in the past. So you organize your class around the sections in the textbook, and the textbook often really leaves things out. And usually those things are ordinary real life things, like as you noted before, there's a lot of politics. There's lots of warfare, lots of kind of major moments, which, they are major moments. They affect a lot of people. So that's completely understandable. But I think what we miss along the way are the real personal life stories of actual people who, I mean, if we're talking about US history, people who lived in North America, in the United States, you're getting a very kind of Washington, D.C. point view of everything, very East Coast view of a lot of things. And unfortunately, that hasn't changed, I think, all that much from the time I was a student to the time you are now a student, right?
Yeah.
Which is a long period of time, Jay. I'm sorry to say. But um, yeah, I mean, I think there have been some improvements, and I think that I mean, you probably learn way more about African American history than I ever did as a high school student. But a lot of things still get left out.
Yeah, and one of the things that I noticed about the Three-Cornered War, and a lot of the themes in that book is that history does look really different when it's viewed from the perspective of ordinary people as opposed to famous leaders like our Lincolns and our Washingtons. Now, why is that perspective so important about looking through things through the lens of somebody normal?
Yeah, I think we tend to just see history through that lens of the most important people. And when you do that, you're really only going to get, especially in the 19th century, the history of white men, right? Because white men held office, white men made major political decisions, they fought in wars. And so that's really the only viewpoint that you get. And so in the Three-Cornered War, it was really important to me to show the multiple conflicts over this space, over New Mexico territory, from as many different perspectives as I could find. And so the story of the Confederate campaign for New Mexico is not told, as it usually is, through the general in charge, Henry Sibley, but through a kind of rank and file soldier who was living in Texas, Bill Davidson, who signed up for the war because he believed in the Confederate cause. He was not a slave owner himself, but he was, invested in slavery as an institution. And you really get a kind of ground level view of his experience, what it was like to kind of march through West Texas, what it was like to go into battle, which was terrifying, and really kind of befuddling. We know now how all of these battles turned out, but these guys had no idea. They were on the ground. They were like, well, I guess we're going to charge that position because the officer has told us to. So I think it's important to know the experiences of real people engaging in these activities, and to, especially with something like warfare. Because too often I think we just talk about war on this very kind of high abstract level, and we don't think about like what are people's experiences on the ground? Like, what are soldiers actually doing? How are they experiencing this? What about all the civilians kind of in the mix, people whose towns they're marching through, whose food they're taking to feed their own armies? How is this affecting all sorts of people on the ground? So it was important for me to really show that experience rather than just the major military movements and the orders and all of those things. And, luckily, because so many soldiers wrote diaries and letters and memoirs, we have access to those experiences. So I was able to kind of piece together the battle chapters in that book through many different sources that kind of gave you both sides of the battle itself. And there are actually kind of three accounts in the Battle of Valverde chapter. It's Bill Davidson and then a Northern soldier named Alonzo Ickes and then Kit Carson. So, they're all revolving and giving you, I think, a much more kind of comprehensible idea of what war was really like then, and shows you that history was not in 2D, right? It was in 3D. Like there were living people doing these things.
Yeah, I really like that 2D image because often I feel like we look at things through, especially in school and history classes, through kind of a bird's eye view, like a big picture idea. And of course, that big picture is important to make connections to different time periods, but seeing things from the ground, like you're saying, and kind of seeing that 3D world around us and how an everyday person is seeing the same battles that Washington is seeing and how that's different, it's
Mhm.
it's an important perspective to have.
Yes, absolutely.
Um, and kind of back on this idea of the American West, many people see it through the lens of Manifest Destiny as a place of freedom, adventure, opportunity. How much of that image is myth and how much of that is reality through your own research?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question because the whole myth of the West and the frontier is one of the kind of most important and longest lasting, like enduring national narratives that we have. I mean, you can still see it in play in all kinds of things in the show Yellowstone, Beyonce's album Cowboy Carter, I mean, the frontier and its imagery and the West kind of show up all the time in our consciousness. And much of that is based in reality. Like, for example, there were black cowboys. So like Beyonce's kind of reference to that, especially in Texas, where she is from, is completely legit. Like that is on the up and up, right? Um, But it really is kind of reinforcing, again, as we were talking about before, very kind of simple ideas about the American West. And the reality of the West on the ground was very different. Like many people were able to take advantage of the freedoms and opportunities that the West offered. And most of the time that happened before the American West was really organized politically. Because once you got a territorial legislature in there, into many of these places in the American West, which came into the Union as territories and then states kind of at mid 19th century and later. And once that happened, then more and more people's rights were restricted, right? So
Yeah.
that, indigenous peoples who thought these territories were ridiculous, right? I mean, from their point of view, this is their territory. Like, and the American government had nothing to do with it. And just because they had a paper that said this is now New Mexico territory meant nothing to them. They were like, no, this is a Pacharia. This is Navajo country. This is not New Mexico, right? But when the US government moves in, when the US military moves in, that creates a system in which, especially indigenous people, and then also in the context of New Mexico specifically, Hispano New Mexicans who really, they had been Mexican before 1848, right? So they had just come into the country by the time Americans are fighting the Civil War and had really only been considered American citizens for about, 12 years. So do they have the same rights as white Americans in other parts of the country? Are they able to keep the lands that they had under Mexican land grants? All of these were questions. And so there are certain spaces in the American West that do offer freedom and opportunity. And some people are able to take advantage of federal laws like the Homestead Act or the Pacific Railway Act. But for many other people, the kind of advent of federal power in the West means that their rights are going to be taken away. So what we see is a real shift kind of at mid 19th century. And it's not that those freedoms and opportunities went away entirely, but they didn't exist in the same way, or for certain groups of people, they were eliminated entirely.
Yeah, and I think outside of just the West, when we look at the Civil War era in American general, do you see it as a uniquely divided period as well? Like we were just talking about all these different groups
Mhm.
with their conflicts, or are there similarities to the divisions that we see today in America?
Yeah, Mark Twain pretty famously said, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does echo, which I think is a good way of looking at it because, the experiences that we're having today with such incredibly deep divisions, politically and culturally, between people, within the same state, but then also between regions in this country. If you look at a political map and sort of how it's breaking down, it does break down regionally in many ways. You can see those echoes, right? You can see an emerging class of politicians and wealthy elites who just want power and they want control and they want minority rule because they know that that's the only way they can have power.
Mhm.
And so you see a lot of gerrymandering, you see a lot of vote restriction today, which we did see in the 19th century. Even with the Civil War brings emancipation to the United States, and 4 million African Americans are now fully free, and the men are able to participate in American politics, but their votes and their voting rights are kind of taken away in the later 19th century, both on the state level and then ultimately kind of federally because of gerrymandering, because of different vote requirements and other kinds of laws that Southern and Western states and territories were passing. And so you can see echoes of the past, and those divisions are real. And, I know that a lot of people talk right now about, oh, are we going to have another civil war? Is this really going to happen? I don't think that that will be the case. I mean, in 1860, with the waves of secession, I mean, basically the argument was you can't do that. I mean, Lincoln was like, no, the Union is perpetual.
Yeah.
Like the Constitution does not create a provision for its own dissolution, right? There is no, there's no mechanism for secession in the Constitution. Um, and they did it anyway, right? And you can see that kind of defiance and that kind of just complete and total rejection of the Constitution from some quarters now, in reference to some different things, but still a
Yeah.
kind of complete disregard for the law or for expectation or custom. Um, but I still do think that the way that political power is structured in this country, the whole idea of just not having elections at all, or um, states doing something like seceding, it's just not possible. I don't think that will happen. And without that, I don't think there will be actual armed warfare between states in the United States. Um, but I do think that we are going to see more of the people kind of rising up. So more of an echo of the 1960s rather than the 1860s. Um, but those echoes really are there, and I think that has to do a lot with, unfortunately, kind of human nature, and then also the ways that the United States has that we as a people have made mistakes in the past and not course corrected in a way that would have like changed the way that we do our politics, the way that the economy works. Kind of, we didn't actually, after the Civil War, make any substantive changes to protect equality and to really bring um, the fullness of the American population into the body politic.
Yeah, I always find this like a really interesting question because I guess every generation probably says the same thing, but we live at a pretty interesting moment where we have an insane amount of sectionalism between North and South and West, kind of like we saw during that time period, but also a heightened sense of interdependency on the markets from one another and just socially from one another that we didn't see during that time period to this level. And
Mhm.
then, like you were saying, echoes from the 1960s. We see that a lot um, with a lot of our social movements today, whether it be kind of the conservative backlash in the 70s versus the
Right.
earlier 60s, more progressive movements. I think it's a really interesting time period. And I agree. I feel like we're far from a civil war America, but we're not
Mhm.
far from a super divided America. And
Right.
I think that comes with its own dangers as well.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Now, on a more cheerful note, have you ever come across a historical story from that time period, Civil War or Western expansion, that seemed almost too unbelievable to be true when you first heard
Mhm.
about it?
Most of the most unbelievable things that I run into my research have to do with individuals who I had no idea they even knew each other and they meet. And you don't, like in the Three Cornered War, John Clark, who is the surveyor, the New Mexico state surveyor, and he had been appointed by Lincoln, and his job was to kind of figure out how to divvy up the land and sell it in New Mexico territory. And he, just kind of runs into Kit Carson, like out
Really?
out in north, like kind of what is now kind of western New Mexico. He was on his way to the gold fields, and he just runs into Kit Carson, and they have this conversation. um, and those are two protagonists in the book who I didn't know ever met. So that was when you run into that stuff, especially when you're not prepared for it, you just are kind of reading through the sources and you're like, whoa, wait a minute. And I also didn't know John Clark's diaries. There are 25 volumes of them in a library in New Mexico, and they're amazing. And there's another protagonist in the book, Louisa Canby, who was married to one of the major generals in the US Army. And she was in Santa Fe. And I found out, I was having trouble. It's always difficult to dig up a lot of resources about women
Hmm.
and also like any non-white person in the US West, because they just didn't either enter the record as often or they didn't leave records that we can access as much. And so you kind of have to really get creative and dig around and find other sources. And I had no idea that he knew her when I started reading his diaries. I mean, it made sense, I guess, because they were in Santa Fe in the 1860s, but he really loved and admired her. And so he wrote about her a lot in
That's
his
interesting.
diaries. And he wrote these incredible sections where he talked about how they would go to seances together in Santa Fe during the winter of 1862, which means, they all gathered together and there was a medium there and they thought they were going to talk to the dead. That the dead would, like ghosts were going to speak through this medium and they were going to be able to ask them questions and do things. And sometimes they had like what we would, I don't know if you've ever used like a Ouija board or you know what it is.
I know what it is. Yeah.
Okay, that it was very popular when I was a kid to get to use Ouija boards and like sleepovers to try and contact the ghosts. And he had these long passages where he talked about going to these dinner parties with her and having these seances. And that's the kind of thing, again, as we were talking about, that we miss when we only talk about wars and politics, right? Like we miss these sort of amazing moments on the ground where ordinary people meet each other and they do just like really wild things. So those are the moments in my research, especially because the 19th century West is so huge
Yeah.
and so relatively like not underpopulated or unpopulated, but it doesn't have the numbers that we have today, right? So the fact that out of a pretty small population, these people who I've kind of chosen for various reasons to talk about in the book end up meeting or crossing paths in some way it's just really fun and cool when you discover something like that.
Yeah, and I agree. I feel like that's something that you would miss if you're only looking at the big picture, the ideas. I guess that's another reason there's an importance in looking at things from a ground perspective as well.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, now, what do you think younger audiences most misunderstand people my age about American history in
Mhm.
general from what you've seen?
I think one of the things, I mean, I think a lot of adults assume this too, but I especially think that a lot of kids think of history as really boring, right? Like it's a class you have to take, in high school, and it's a lot of dates. And as we were discussing before, because they kind of have to, teachers have to go really fast. You are moving through American history at a pretty rapid clip, and you're not like really able to kind of have these moments where you're doing in-depth research, usually, unless you're taking like an honors or an AP class. And so um, I feel like this is actually more important than any topic you might misunderstand, but this idea that history is just a boring list of dates or that, it's not interesting to think about it or write about it or research it. I mean, I think it's really too bad because really fundamentally, um, history is a group of stories. It's a group of narratives that we tell about ourselves, and we all love stories, right? Like this is how we learn to read. This is why people love getting immersed in books or in television shows or I mean, even video games have like really sophisticated storytelling these days.
Yeah.
And if you think about history as storytelling and as a kind of um, a collection of stories that different communities in the nation tell about themselves and about America in general. I think that is a way more compelling way to think about history than just, oh, I have to memorize all of these dates and know what it means when the US is in an industrial revolution, like something like that. So that I think I wish more students, were able to and had the time to engage with history on a storytelling level, because I think they'd enjoy it a lot more.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think history is, at least in my opinion, like the most fascinating topic
Mhm.
that I cover in school. I mean, I always say
Mhm.
it to friends, to family that history gives you a view of human nature. It teaches you
Mhm.
about evolution probably more comprehensively than Darwin's biology does. I
Mm.
mean,
Hmm.
I mean, you are seeing firsthand how people act when put in situations, not just in theory, which is
Right.
history. History has a special place for me at least.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
no, I love that. I love that comparison to Darwin. I think that's
yeah,
great. Yeah.
and one final question.
Yes.
If you had to leave younger audiences with one takeaway about the Civil War era, about the West, whatever you
Mhm.
would like it to be, what would it be?
I think the kind of content takeaway would be that the Civil War was about the North and the South, but it was also about the West.
Mhm.
You know, that it was about white Americans and Black Americans, but it was also about Indigenous Americans. It was about Hispano Americans. Um, it was a much broader conflict, and in fact, a continental conflict. It was not just the North and the South battling it out. And then after the war, they turned to the West. The West was always a part of the equation during the Civil War. So that would be my content takeaway. But yeah, then my other takeaway is related to what we were just talking about, which is history is really fun. And
Mhm.
I'm glad that you enjoy it. And I'm glad that you
Thank you.
find it fascinating because I do too. And there's so many interesting people who lived in the past, whose stories we don't know yet. And I would just really love for your generation to really kind of take that up as something fun and interesting and kind of worth their time.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.